Welcome, and thank you for joining this webinar launching our new book, A Vision of Hope, Catholic Schooling in Massachusetts. I'm Mary Connaughton, Pioneer's Director of Government Transparency and Director of Finance and Administration, as well as a proud Catholic school mom. I hope you and your family to thank Mike Reardon and the Catholic Schools Foundation for partnering with us on this event. We're so pleased to be joined today by Tom Carroll, Superintendent of Schools for the Archdiocese of Boston, and Patrick Wolf, Distinguished Professor of Education Policy at the University of Arkansas. Please note that the audience will be muted for this program. If you have any questions, please submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We will review them at the end of the program. As George Weigel, the definitive biographer of Pope St. John Paul II, wrote in his foreword to our book, Catholic schools must be for empowerment. Schools that begin their work from the premise that students of all backgrounds, especially students from poor families, are people with potential. That potential, spiritual, intellectual, economic, cultural, and civic, will be unleashed when students are formed morally as well as educated intellectually, when students are powered to become men and women of character, as well as men and women of competence and culture. To honor these ideals and what Catholic schools have accomplished for generations, we enlisted Chris Cynicolo and Carroll to help us produce this book. Catholic schools have achieved so much and are an indispensable school choice option for so many families in Massachusetts and across the country. Massachusetts Catholic schools are a national model. In the couple areas of common testing, the Bay State's Catholic schools, which if aggregated would be the largest school district in our state, outperformed the Commonwealth's K-12 public system and do so at a fraction of the cost. Now, if that weren't enough, the Catholic schools educate their students in religious principles and ideals that make their students not just academically proficient, but spiritually proficient to live both good and happy lives. Yet Catholic schools in Massachusetts and across the country face daunting obstacles. Consider this: despite excellent results, the number of Catholic schools in Boston has fallen from 225 in 1942 to 100 in 2020. 20 have closed since 2015, and another 10 have shuttered during the pandemic. These closings disproportionately impact our poor and working class families in Boston, Chelsea, Lowell, and beyond. A barrier to greater access to Catholic schools and religious schools of all kinds have been the 1855 Know-Nothing Amendment to the Massachusetts Constitution. Conceived in 19th century anti-Catholic nativism, this infamous amendment, and another added in 1917, have blocked religiously affiliated parents from accessing public funds through private school choices like vouchers and education tax credits. Thankfully, with the recent U.S. Supreme Court victory in the landmark Espinoza school choice case, these know-nothing or Blaine amendments are largely neutralized in the nearly 40 states that have them. Religiously affiliated schools in Massachusetts and religious school choice advocates in Massachusetts and other states must mobilize now to enact state-driven private school choice programs. The Commonwealth has the second highest percentage of Catholics in the nation. To help our Catholic school parents of all backgrounds and zip codes, we must join our neighbors, New Hampshire and Rhode Island, and 18 other states that have established education tax credit programs. If as a country, we're serious about closing achievement gaps and providing far wider education equity, we need more thriving Catholic schools. We know that even during the COVID-19 pandemic, the number of students attending Archdiocese of Boston schools has increased by 4,400. This tells us there's a huge untapped demand for the nation-leading Catholic schools in Massachusetts. To tell us more about our new book and the ways to help expand access to Catholic schools, I'm pleased to introduce to you two co-editors of this book, Carroll and Chris Cynicolo. Carroll serves as a Director of Education Opportunity, focusing on private school choice for Excellent Ed. She is Senior Fellow with Pioneer Institute. Chris Cynicolo is a writer and editor with more than 30 years experience in the fields of journalism, marketing, healthcare, and freelance writing. From 1987 to 2015, Cynicolo was editor, reporter, columnist, and editorial page editor at the Worcester Telegram and Gazette. Joining us later in the program are Tom Carroll, the Superintendent of Schools for the Archdiocese of Boston, and Patrick Wolf, the Distinguished Professor of Education Policy at the University of Arkansas. Take it away, Kara.
Thank you so very much, Mary. And Sailor, if you have the opportunity to bring up the slides that we've prepared for our audience, now might be a good time to do that. Mary has already introduced me, but needless to say, I'm so happy to be here talking about this book, which has been long in coming. I am really privileged to be a senior fellow at Pioneer Institute. I think it's important to describe the work that I do in the other part of my life at the Foundation for Excellence in Education, otherwise known as Excel@Ed. And there I am the Director of Educational Opportunity, which means I oversee the policy work around private school choice, meaning I get the opportunity to evaluate, to help other states advance private school choice in a way that ensures that they're doing it in a high quality way. As somebody who lives right here in Newton, Massachusetts, I am very, very excited to be having this conversation, not only about Catholic schools, but about the potential to help more students access them through private school choice programs, which is just one of the many things we touch upon in this book. I want to take a moment to talk about this particular moment, because as I said, this book has been a long time coming. In fact, it's a compilation of essays, some of which were written many years ago, some of which were written as far back as 10 years ago and have been updated. Interestingly, so much of what we wrote then holds true now, especially in terms of who Catholic schools serve and how they are performing. Unfortunately, one of the threads that has gone through the work through the past 10 years is the idea that Catholic schools are increasingly vulnerable in our society, meaning that they've been closing at unprecedented and alarming rates. And there are a number of reasons for that, which we get into in a couple of the chapters in the book. But the important thing I think to highlight here is that the Catholic schools that are most vulnerable in this country, and indeed in Massachusetts, are those that are located in urban centers and are committed, as all Catholic schools are, to serving any student who wants to access the Catholic education, any student who wants to access what they're offering. So as I'm sure Superintendent Carroll will explain to us, oftentimes what this means is that Catholic schools are charging tuition that doesn't actually match the cost of what it takes to educate the children they enroll. They make big sacrifices to do this, but instead they remain committed to serving as many children as they can, as many children that want a Catholic education as they can, and they do so in an academically excellent way. I think it's important to note as well that Catholic schools serve a really diverse population of students. They serve students not only from different socioeconomic backgrounds. In urban centers, they tend to serve students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and those who do not have other educational options, but they also serve students of very diverse faith. And parents, I think, are attracted, well, not I think, I know, in fact, are attracted to Catholic schools for a variety of reasons, including high academic standards, academic excellence, but as Mary mentioned, those faith principles, the character development that is inherent in Catholic education, the values-laden Catholic education that these schools can provide is important to parents of all faiths. So in fact, parents of many faiths will say, I might not have access to a school that will educate my child in my faith, but wow, the principles of Catholic education are quite important to me. I want to, and you can go ahead and advance, Sailor, please, if you don't mind. I want to take a second to talk about this current moment, this book now. So as I said, even though it's been in the works for a long time, in the midst of this pandemic that we've all been experiencing, as Mary noted, Catholic schools, like a lot of other private schools, have in fact been open. And so I'm sure Superintendent Carroll will speak to the fact that they've been safely open in many, many places. And we've seen a little bit of an uptick in demand, but, and because they've been open, but that's not to say that these schools still aren't vulnerable. So prior to the pandemic, what we saw were the closure of Catholic schools, well over 120, I believe, in the country nationwide. And most located in urban centers. So as the pandemic has hit the most vulnerable in our society, it has hit the most vulnerable schools as well, serving in many cases the most vulnerable children. I think that makes this study, this book that we have to offer you today, incredibly relevant, because it's about ensuring a way to keep these schools accessible and open for those who want them, and in fact, for those who need them. So as Mary mentioned, and as I've already said, we know that about this Catholic school phenomenon. We've known for decades that Catholic schools can serve students of diverse backgrounds. And when you compare how students of diverse backgrounds do in Catholic schools to how they do in district schools, there's something that we call a Catholic schools effect, meaning academic outcomes are increased. Although some of these data are old, the trends remain true, right? I said some of these chapters were written a while ago, but the trends remain true. And that's schools in the Archdiocese of Boston, by and large, outperform schools on norm-referenced examinations on average. So you see the national average versus the Archdiocese of Boston. And mind you, these are not schools that are serving children that come in from different backgrounds with high amounts of cultural and social capital. This is, we believe, part of the school effect, a commitment to academic excellence. And Saylor, if you could go ahead. And I think that the other thing that we've seen that we talk about in this book over time is not only that Catholic schools continue to be academically excellent, but in response to the changing needs of our society, in response to the changing needs of families, they've in fact continued to develop some pretty innovative models, again, serving a wide range of students. So we see across the country Montessori Catholic preschools popping up. Right here in Massachusetts, we're home to 2 Cristo Rey schools, which have a phenomenal work-study program. These are schools that are only for students who couldn't otherwise afford to pay tuition. And one of the ways they pay their tuition is through engaging in a work-study program, which gives them both really high-level job training in a variety of careers, as well as the ability to attend an academically excellent Catholic school. And we also have a wonderful chapter in the book that talks about the opportunities for vocational education in Catholic schooling. And as many of you already know, Massachusetts is home to several really wonderful vocational schools, very academically excellent, competitive vocational schools. And Catholic schools are also increasingly looking at how they can serve children with VocaTech programs. Saylor, if you wouldn't mind advancing again. So academics matter, diversity of school models matter, and providing students and families access to the type of education they want matters. But here in Massachusetts, that is far more difficult than it is in fact, 26 other states across this country. So Mary mentioned at the outset that Massachusetts and 40, I believe, maybe Dr. Wolf will correct me, 40 plus other states have Blaine amendments in their constitution. And essentially what this does is a Blaine amendment says that monies may not be transferred to schools. In Massachusetts, it's to all private schools, but in many states, it was schools of a religious character. The recent Supreme Court decision in Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue, we go into deep detail about this in the book. It has raised really important questions for Massachusetts. So some say that Massachusetts Blaine Amendment is so strong as to not be impacted by this case, in which the justices decided that if a state has a private school choice program, if it is going to in fact allow children to access private schools with government funds, they may not discriminate against those schools on the basis of being faith-based. Massachusetts' Blaine Amendment is very strong, along with Michigan's, but many believe that there's a part of the court's decision that allows room for our Blaine Amendment to in fact perhaps be overturned. That aside, there are opportunities, as we go into in the book, as other states have presented to families, for us to allow students and families to access private schools, including Catholic schools, by raising private money. So tax credit scholarships, and Mary mentioned that Rhode Island, New Hampshire both have them. Our neighbors to the north, New Hampshire, I should mention, have some very interesting private school choice legislation on the table right now that I think will put this Commonwealth to shame in terms of the kind of access it will provide families. These are the kinds of states we should be looking to. But a tuition tax credit scholarship is one way for folks to donate to scholarship granting organizations in exchange for a tax credit. And those scholarship granting organizations ensure that families who need them get access to the schools they want, including Catholic schools. And so, Sailor, I'm going to ask you to advance it. And I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Chris Cynicolo, who was really the muscle behind this book. I have to say, Chris, thank you so much for doing all the hard work of making this come together. But one of the things Chris is going to talk to you about is the urgent need that the authors of each chapter of this book raise to preserve Catholic schooling in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Kara, and thank you, Mary, for a lovely introduction. It's been very interesting, as you both noted, this point in time, and in a year marked by so much loss and difficulty. It's been a real pleasure to work with a great group of folks and to look back at the last, well, really the last 25 or 30 years, and then further even. As Mary noted, in my previous work with the Telegram and Gazette, I had the opportunity to obviously report on, comment on, and work with a wide variety of folks. Education was always one of those topics that's near and dear to my heart, and is obviously in the news all the time. And I was fortunate in that my career more or less mirrored the rise of charter schools, the most notable, perhaps new phenomenon in Massachusetts education and across the country. So to look back at these chapters, which were originally white papers, some of which I read at the time, went to programs on, thought about, wrestled with editorially and so forth, and to bring them together, to update them, to work with Kara and the other authors to do so, has been very interesting. And I think it's brought home to me the need for the diversity and strength that Catholic education specifically brings to the table. We've seen obviously some decline in the number of schools, even as demand continues to improve. And as Kara aptly pointed out, the performance that Catholic schools post is really remarkable. And I think the same can be said in a way of the charter schools. While there may be exceptions, I think there's little debate after 25 plus years of charter schools in this state that we have a lot of great choices out there. And I think the point for me that matters most is that the idea of diversity matters a great deal. And I mean diversity of thought and education, having the options out there for parents. Increasingly, as I went through my career in newspapering and even afterwards since then, I've grown more and more, I don't know if radical is the right word, but more and more willing to say that we need to throw caution to the wind and really let parents direct the education of their children. In my own experience with 4 children, we did homeschooling, we did vocational schooling, some Catholic schooling. My wife has taught at parochial schools, public schools, charter schools. So we've seen education from many different angles. And there's no question in my mind that the distinctive advantage that Catholic schools deliver is anchoring all of the knowledge in an understanding of the world that is simply different from what you're getting in regular public schools, if you will. There's that understanding that there's something beyond us, that it matters. When we talked earlier, as George Weigel points out, about character, competence, and culture, those are elements that are really indispensable to creating independent, strong thinkers, men and women in the modern world. So the process of editing this has been, as I say, a real pleasure, and has allowed me to think more deeply, I think, than ever before about where we're going with education. And Kara was very kind to say I did the heavy lifting on this. Really, this book would be nothing without her and the other authors whose original work and research was really extraordinary, and took my mind to places I hadn't gone before, thinking about things more deeply. So Kara, I don't know whether you wanted to chime in on some of that or give a little more details, or maybe it's time for us to turn this over to Tom Carroll, Superintendent of Schools for the Archdiocese of Boston, who I know will have a lot to say about the specific moment that the schools face in ways that I certainly can't speak to specifically.
Yeah, I agree, Chris. Thank you. I think we should absolutely invite Superintendent Carroll into the conversation now, and maybe with some reaction to some of what we've presented here.
Sure.
I don't know if you can hear me. I can't start the video, so somebody's blocking it.
We can hear you. Go ahead, Tom.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, I appreciate that Pioneer Institute took the lead on getting this book prepared. I think it's an amazing contribution to the field of education and to the thought of what's going on in Massachusetts, which I'm originally from New York, moved here a little over almost 2 years ago. And Massachusetts has long been a place that everybody else in the rest of the country is looking to for the quality of the education and the quality of engagement around education issues. As it relates to Catholic schools, where I've been the superintendent since April of 2019, I think the starting point is really what's different about Catholic schools, kind of what is our value proposition. And I think the most important factor to start with is that we view children as created in the image and likeness of God. And I'll explain in a second how that's played out during the pandemic. Second, we explicitly focus on instilling virtue and faith. So unlike a secular public school, which in many cases is not able to discuss that, and certainly not able to take a stand or take a side, we're very explicit that our schools were set up to evangelize the faith and to instill virtue in children. And we've drawn very diverse set of parents from many multiple faiths who appreciate that we do that, even if they have sectarian differences on particular teachings. Third, which has been a highlight of the book and has already been discussed, we have very strong academic results for a small fraction of the cost of the public schools across Massachusetts. And we have a strong commitment to diversity. We're running Catholic schools. We are Catholic. I'm Catholic, but our doors are open to all comers. We don't, whether it's we're running a soup kitchen or serving somebody who's homeless or helping an immigrant get into the country, whatever it might be, we never ask somebody for their Catholic card before we decide to help them. So that commitment to service and to openness, and Catholic, the word actually means universal. That commitment to serve all people has resulted in a school that, a set of schools that has, one, very diverse options, but also very diverse student bodies and very diverse families. And that's the cornerstone of the Catholic approach. There are three illustrations or 3 points that I want to touch on that kind of illustrate this. First, all of our schools were open for live instruction. We have 100 schools across the Archdiocese. The Archdiocese of Boston is the largest, geographically the largest district. We're the second largest district if you combine all the schools, Catholic schools in Massachusetts, and all the students we serve. We're the largest school district in the state. A lot of people don't think of it that way, and it's not our governance structure to act like a unified district. But we do have a very big footprint. Much in the ways on the Catholic charity side, it has the largest nonprofit social service footprint in the state. So in Massachusetts, more than most other states, the Catholic footprint here in multiple dimensions is very large. We decided very early on that we were going to do, after doing the remote instruction that we were forced to do by circumstances in the early days of the pandemic, and as superintendent in consultation with the Cardinal, we closed our schools actually before the state asked us to close them and before the city of Boston closed public schools in Boston. So we were very sensitive to kind of the crazy early days, but we quickly concluded that although we closed on a Friday, Monday and Tuesday, we had remote instruction up and running. And by the end of the week, a lot of the initial kinks that we had been worked out. Most districts took 2 or 3 weeks before they started re-engaging with students. And that difference, I think, relates to, if you do believe that children are created in the image and likeness of God, you do not abandon them in the middle of a pandemic. Our teachers, even though they had their own families to take care of, were engaged right away. Having said that, when the school year was over, we all looked back and said, we did better than everybody else, we think, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in terms of keeping our commitment to families, keeping the students engaged, and keeping the level of academic performance up. But in reality, it was not the same thing as live instruction. So with no dissent whatsoever across all of our schools, the only question we had was whether we would be allowed to reopen or whether the State Department of Health would prohibit it. So we urged in direct conversations with the governor's office and other people that we did want to proceed. The governor ultimately allowed all schools to proceed. And then there were two different responses to that. On the public side, they engaged in a series of discussions with unions and other stakeholders about whether they would open. And we engaged in discussions on how to open. That moment in time, I think, crystallizes the difference between kind of the bureaucratic, lumbering, approach that the districts often take, a stakeholder-driven model, where we had a child-centered model. Everybody, the parents understood and the teachers understood that the remote education, the way it was being done, was not serving children well, and we wanted to get everyone back in school. On the public side, as a side, every year, any school system has new kids coming in. So you have a lot of new kids that have come into schools for a variety of reasons. They've moved or what have you, who have literally never met their classmates and never met their teachers because they've stayed remote. I just don't think that's a viable approach. The second thing is, I would just make a point somewhat humorously about the church is essentially a bureaucracy that's been around for 2 millennia. And the fact that we were more nimble on moving speaks volumes about how bureaucratic some of the public school districts have become, because we have our own bureaucracy, but we were much quicker and rapid. And we, over the summer, had to do technology instruction for 4,200 people. And the districts privately admitted to the mayor and others that our technology was way ahead of where they were at that point. And we gave them access to our meetings just to help them. Now, the second point I'd like to make has to do with COVID and the role of science. We early on, as a church and as a school system, embraced science and health data. And we decided we were going to let it all lead us wherever it led us, wherever the facts led us. And the reality was there was no compelling case for schools not to reopen. And the reason is really simple. Schools are controlled environments. The one thing Catholic schools do above all else is we teach kids how to follow instructions. Even without any nuns left, everybody follows instructions. So surviving this pandemic is all about taking the health protocols seriously and having people follow them religiously, so to speak, every single day, day in and day out. So what you have is two different scenarios. Outside of our school buildings, in the community, very few people are following all of the health protocols, which is why the cases have gone up and up and up and up. In schools, we followed them very religiously. So the contrast is we have had consistently a rising number of cases of what I call outside-in cases, cases that are brought from outside into a school. We can't control for that because they got infected somewhere else. Because we follow the protocols, those people are quarantined right away. And because the way we sanitize the schools and kids are in nice, neat Catholic rows and all the rest, we have had right now, we have 3 cases, I think, out of 35,500 people in our schools. We have 3 cases of instances of spread within our school, all because somebody brought it in from outside. So all the belief that we were going to become kind of a vector by being the only system across the state that was open from day one turned out not to be true whatsoever. Once that was known by the end of September, early October, all the school districts should have acted on that information. We continue to follow science and the data. We continue to act responsibly, and the school districts pretended as if there was no data on which to make a decision. Third, because we have a commitment to equity to every child, we invested heavily in technology and training, because that was the only way to ensure that all children had access to, not only in the early stage of the pandemic, to education at all, but we also made a commitment to respect parental choice. We had, when we opened, about 5% of the parents were just not comfortable having their kids in school, either because they had an exposed person in the household or because, a health compromised person in the household, most often a grandparent or somebody with multiple health issues, or they just simply were nervous about how it was all going to work out. We respected that parental point of view. And so even in all the schools that are open, any classroom that had a kid whose parents wanted him to stay home, we live stream the classes. So kind of like an NFL football game, you can go to the stadium and watch the game, or you can stay home and watch it on your couch. And sometimes the view from the couch is better and you're closer to the bathroom and the refrigerator. So that's a choice that some people made, and we respected that school choice because we support that. I believe that the book that has not been written is not, the book has been written on what we did right. The book that's yet to be written is on what school districts are doing, which I am surprised has not sparked a moral outrage. The impact of these children not being in school for an extended period of time, some cases over a year, depending on the school district, is going to have a very lasting and profound negative impact on learning. And it's also going to cause very serious social and emotional issues with an awful lot of children. And the people who are going to be hurt the most are the most disadvantaged. And the people who are going to be hurt the most are homeless children who obviously cannot easily do remote learning, and as well children with disabilities or special needs, because their services cannot in most cases be attended to on a remote basis. So that's something I think people need to give a lot of thought to and focus on. Lastly, I would just close with this final point, which is I think the contrast that we've seen in terms of results, in terms of focus on virtue and faith for parents for whom that's interest, that is a high priority for them in raising their children, and the completely different approach that the Catholic schools have taken versus the other schools underscores the need to have a substantial expansion of school choice in Massachusetts. Whether that's done through scholarships or some other form, people can debate. I happen to be a big fan of a tax credit scholarship initiative and think it would be great if we took what has worked very successfully in other states, and it was the cornerstone of what prompted the Espinoza case that knocked down the Blaine amendments. I think it would be a great way to unleash private philanthropy and substantially increase the volume of scholarships. We did everything we could to expand scholarships when the pandemic happened. The Children's Scholarship Fund, which was, or the Catholic Schools Foundation, excuse me, which was mentioned earlier, put up about $1 million in extra scholarships to help families that suddenly found their income drop dramatically because of the loss of jobs, to help them continue through the year. But the volume of scholarships we need so that every person who wants to go to a Catholic school can go can only be done with publicly funded school choice. A couple people have talked about the decline in the number of schools, the decline in the enrollment since the mid 60s. We don't have a shortage of people who want to go to Catholic schools. We have a shortage of people who can afford to go to Catholic schools. And that's not because we're super expensive at the elementary level. Tuitions range from $5,000 to $7,000 or $8,000 per child. But the problem is it costs a lot more to run the school than we're able to charge in tuition. And so parents need a greater level of scholarships to make sure that the poorest can get into school and that they can stay in school. And if we had this program, a dramatically higher number of students would be enrolled in our schools. In Florida, more than 100,000 new people are enrolled in private schools because of the existence of their tax credit scholarship program, originally set up when in the first year of Governor Jeb Bush. That's 100,000 people who would have not had that choice were it not for that program. So I don't know what the secret number is in Massachusetts, but it's literally, tens of thousands of people who want to have their kids in Catholic schools are not able to access a system that they know more closely aligns with the values and faith of their family, and also will give them the academic results they need for their child to succeed. For poor families, the surest ticket out of poverty is getting your child into Catholic school. And for too many people, that isn't a possibility, for the simple reason that Massachusetts has not adopted a tax credit scholarship or other form of widespread school choice. So with that, let me turn it over now to Patrick.
Thank you, Tom. I'm delighted to be here. And Kara, I'll just say that you were very close. There are 38 states that, like Massachusetts, including Massachusetts, that have Blaine type no aid amendments. So you were definitely within the margin of error with 40. So in the 1980s, there was an infamous commercial for the Hair Club for Men. So this was a company that provided information and products for aging dudes like me who wanted to preserve what they had up top here. The commercial famously ended with the actor saying, "I'm not just a spokesman for the Hair Club for Men, I'm also a client." Well, I can honestly say I'm not only a scholar of Catholic education, I'm also a proud product of it. My sisters and I grew up in a single parent family in St. Cloud, Minnesota, and we received free lunches at our parochial school. We were that poor. I also received need-based financial aid at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul and graduated from St. Thomas 12th in my class. After 16 years of Catholic education, I went on to complete my doctorate in government from Harvard University. So that led me to wonder, how did a kid like me with so many strikes against him succeed in my goal of being a doctor of political science and eventually a distinguished professor of education policy? And I always was convinced that my Catholic schooling played a significant role. When we study the literature on Catholic schooling, and here I'm going to reinforce a number of points that have been made by my distinguished colleagues already, and then provide some pretty strong guidance for the future. But when we look at the record of Catholic schools, they have succeeded greatly in promoting learning, civics, and spirituality. So what we might summarize as mind, body, politic, and soul. So first, mind. Two eminent sociologists, James Coleman and Anthony Breich, led studies of the Catholic schooling effect on student achievement in the 1980s and the 1990s. And they both found conclusively that Catholic schools added value in terms of student learning. And we still see this in the scores on the National Assessment of Education Progress every 2 years. Catholic schools are identified as a particular school system in the NAEP, and the test scores for Catholic schools are significantly higher than the scores for students in public schools. But children don't just have minds, they also engage in behaviors, and schools have responsibilities to shape those behaviors in ways that serve the public good. And that's where Catholic schools contribute to the body politic. In 2007, I did a vote counting meta-analysis of all of the research on the effect of private schooling, including Catholic schooling, on civic outcomes, such as political tolerance, which is sadly greatly lacking in our current day and age, as well as political knowledge, political participation, and community volunteerism. So these are core civic values that we want young Americans to hold dear. And in this meta-analysis, there were 11 findings about the effect of Catholic schooling on civic outcomes. All of them identified that Catholic schools have a positive effect on civic outcomes. None of those studies found that Catholic schooling threatens or undermines civic values. One of the most prominent studies in that set is by my good friend, Notre Dame political scientist David Campbell. That study was of Catholic schooling in Massachusetts, and it was sponsored by the Pioneer Institute. But as Tom mentioned, children don't just have minds and bodies. They are spiritual beings. They have souls. And Catholic schools are committed to nurturing the souls and guiding the souls of students as well. Now, of course, as a social scientist, it's impossible for me to measure the effect that Catholic schooling has on the souls of children. We can get some proxy measures of that, including a recent study I did with Brad Wilcox and several other scholars, where we found that Catholic schooling is associated with a lower rate of out-of-wedlock births, controlling for a bunch of background characteristics of students. If they attended Catholic school, they had a significantly lower likelihood of producing an out-of-wedlock birth as adults. And in fact, in my Catholic high school in Minnesota, out of a graduating class of 155 students, we had not a single pregnancy among my classmates and I think Ambassadors Flynn and Glendon, in the introduction to this outstanding book, put it very well. They speak to this question about the nurturing of the souls of children through Catholic schools when they say that Catholic education is, quote, a mission to nurture faith and prepare students to live lives illuminated by a Catholic worldview and to look for the face of Christ in every person. So this wonderful set of schools we call Catholic schools is facing a crisis. This crisis has at least 6 causes. They include its cost structure, its revenue structure, a decline in middle-class enrollments, a locational mismatch between existing schools and interested clients, the need to provide quality instruction to high-need students, and the recent COVID-19 crisis. I only have time to touch on one of these, so I'll focus on the COVID-19 crisis. Initially, the pandemic was horrible for Catholic schools. It canceled all the spring fundraisers, which are a major source of revenue for schools. It removed the jobs. It rendered many parents of Catholic school students unemployed and unable to cover their tuition costs. And as Tom mentioned, it closed schools. It forced Catholic schools to shut down and deliver education remotely. So at the start of the pandemic, it looked like this was an existential threat for Catholic schooling. But Catholic schooling has faced very serious threats throughout its history in the United States, and I review some of them in my chapter. And it's always miraculously and with great persistence and grit come through. And we see signs of that for Catholic schooling again here. The silver linings from the COVID effect on Catholic schooling include the fact that the federal government very quickly passed an initiative called the Paycheck Protection Program for private organizations, including private schools. And what the PPP did is it provided forgivable loans to private organizations that they could use to continue to employ their workers, even as revenue was cut off by the pandemic. And the PPP was really a lifeline for Catholic schools across the country. The second silver lining was that Catholic schools returned to face-to-face instruction as quickly as they could safely. And parents recognized and appreciated this. National surveys are demonstrating that parental satisfaction with private schooling in the midst of this pandemic is significantly higher than its satisfaction with public schooling. And this impression that private schools were more committed to delivering effective education to children throughout the pandemic than public schools were in many cases. This general perception has led to some of the enrollment growth that other speakers mentioned in terms of the desire for new families to enroll in Catholic schools. Now, a quick boost of enrollments is not necessarily going to save Catholic education for the long haul. So once the pandemic ebbs, how can Catholic schooling be preserved and nurtured and developed across the country? Well, I think there are two things that have to be done. First, public funding needs to play a stronger role in supporting the children in Catholic schools, preferably via tax credit scholarships or education savings accounts that have broad eligibility. Yes, we value private school choice policies that target very vulnerable populations, such as students with disabilities and low-income students like my family. But that isn't enough for the working class family who wants to send their 3 children to private schools. They need to be included in these assistance programs as well. The whole idea of support programs being inclusive just reminds me of a comment related to what Kara said earlier, and that is, I once heard that the motto of the Catholic Church is, "Here comes everybody." Yes, we're welcoming to everybody, but many of the people who want to come need the kind of support that tax credit scholarships can provide. And finally, Catholic schools must dare to be different from public schools. If they are merely a religious mirror of the public school model, then that's not going to be attractive to enough parents to sustain it. So as Kara mentioned, there are all of these exciting and diverse models of how to deliver Catholic education effectively. Basically, Catholic schooling shouldn't shrink from its Catholicity. Even non-Catholics value the religious ethos of Catholic schools. The bottom line is we shouldn't sacrifice God to save our schools, or miraculous success stories like mine will become all too rare. Thank you, and I welcome my fellow presenters to rejoin us in video and audio for the Q&A session.
Great, thank you, Patrick. I'm Jamie Gass, Director of Pioneer Education, and want to thank everyone for tuning in today. I also want to take the opportunity to thank both Chris Cynicolo and Kara for all their terrific work on this book. There's a lot of time and effort that goes into it, and I really appreciate it, as well as the authors. I also should mention Michaela Dawson and Ryan Kenny, who were instrumental in producing the book, as well as Tom Carroll's leadership. So I have a variety of questions. We have about 15 minutes or so remaining, and we want to try to get through as many as possible. And I'll start off with Kara. In your work across the country, where do you see states making the most traction on private and religious school choice? And what can Catholic school advocates in Massachusetts learn from those states?
I love this question because I get to say, where do I see places making the most progress on private school choice? Well, almost everywhere except Massachusetts right now. This is part of what I want. Some days that's what it feels like for a person who lives here and cares so very much about education in the Commonwealth and children in the Commonwealth. I mean, so some of the places have already been mentioned, right? So Florida, of course, it's actually, Superintendent Carroll referred only to its tax credit scholarship, but Florida now has a huge voucher. Florida now has over 200,000 students that benefit from some form of school choice. That includes charter schools and other forms of public school choice, but most of it is private school choice. So Florida is a great example. Arizona, with some of the longest standing private school choice programs, is a great example. Indiana also has long-standing private school choice programs and has been heralded, and we could get into the details of some things that I would change about all of these programs, but Indiana has been heralded as having a real pluralistic system, meaning that diverse school options flourish for families, and families have a lot of access. So those are some of the long-standing ones, but I think it's really important to point out that in this moment, so a lot has already been said about the pandemic. One of the things that I like to tell my my friends about the pandemic, I think I actually mentioned this yesterday on our podcast, Jamie, is that we're in a moment where those who have always had access to the kind of education they want, mainly through their district schools, the pandemic has caused a lot of people to wake up and go, what are you talking about? I can't have what I want. What are you talking about? This isn't the education that I thought I was getting. And so I've said to some of my friends with great love, well, now you have just an inkling of what it feels like to be a parent who can't afford to move, who can't afford to say, yeah, this isn't working for me, I'm going to go to this school across the street. And so states across the country are waking up to this. And why are they waking up to it? They're waking up to it because parents are a formidable force, right? So we're seeing traction in places like Professor Wolf's home state of Arkansas, Missouri, and we already talked about New Hampshire. I think we should really start looking to New Hampshire. They're sort of, they're providing a good model for us folks. I'm really excited about Idaho, used some of its federal money to stand up what is currently really just a public school choice program, but I think we are going to see some expansion there. So Jamie, bottom line, there's a lot of movement. What can we learn from these folks in terms of how these programs have gotten off the ground? The first is that we know from Florida and some other longstanding programs that when more students, when all students, which I think will eventually happen in Florida, if not eventually, pretty soon, have access to the schools that they want, everyone benefits. So even the students who stay in traditional public schools, or I'm sorry, I should call them district schools, and a lot of this we know from Patrick Wolf's really good work, they benefit. They benefit in terms of academic outcomes, cognitive, non-cognitive outcomes. So it can be good for everybody. A lot of times, especially if you're talking about tax credit scholarships, districts save money, right? Because they're still getting some of those local dollars that, that parents are paying even when their kids attend private schools. The biggest thing I would say though is what I said at the beginning, and that is parents make all the difference. Now is the moment to really make private school choice, to have access to all of the schools that we want and need. Parents need to mobilize, and parents are mobilized. Now is the moment for them to do it. I will point us to the tipping point, what some call the tipping point in Florida, and that is the election, I guess it was all the way 2016, how many years has it been? When some say that the governor's race should have gone the other way, that Andrew Gillum should have won the governor's race, and the current governor sits there because of what they call school choice moms. So largely African-American women who were probably going to vote Democratic, but were afraid that their access to the school of choice, the school they wanted, many of them private schools, would be taken away. So parents are a formidable political force, and that's one of the things we should learn here.
Thanks, Kara. So Chris, George Weigel's foreword to the book is a very compelling piece on the leadership of Pope St. John Paul II. He's a transformative figure in 20th century history. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of George Weigel's foreword? What are we acknowledging enough the world-changing role that John Paul played in our era?
Yeah, I think we are not. We do in the book, but I think generally in society, when you have discussions with folks about the decline and fall of the Soviet Union, for example, and why that came about, and the revolutions that we saw in Eastern Europe and the liberation that that entailed, there's a tendency to think, well, it was inevitable, or it was economic, it was this, it was that. George's foreword does a really wonderful job of pointing out the power of an idea and the power of faith, and how important that was, and how moving it was for people. Folks don't just put themselves on the line, risk everything that they have, as you see in Russia today with the protests against Putin. They don't do that simply because they're hungry or this or that. It's because they're moved by faith. They want something better for themselves, and they believe in something. So there's a lot of reasons, of course, that history has unfolded the way that it has, but certainly I think we underestimate in general the importance that John Paul II played in that entire process.
Tom, so you talked a little bit about it, but strong Catholic identity in schools is a key feature of your efforts in Boston, as well as successful Catholic schools across the country. How is this best achieved? What are the steps that schools need to be following in order to confirm strong faith-based role in kids' lives?
Yeah, first, leaders of Catholic schools need to affirm that the schools were set up to evangelize the faith. And so in a state like Massachusetts, I'm from New York, and it's a similar state politically, where there's been kind of rampant secularism in the broader society. The temptation for a lot of school leaders is to secularize their schools to appeal to the broadest number of people. But I think the fallacy they are creating there or supporting is their value proposition is not that they're the same as public schools. Their value proposition is they're different. The one thing public schools can never do is compete on the matter of faith. And so I frankly, I joke that I should put in my business card, my job is to put Catholic, the Catholic back in Catholic schools, because I think the schools that have chased after all kinds of, technology and other issues, I'm not opposed to all of these kinds of things like a new STEM initiative or what have you, but a Catholic school is never going to buy more laptops than a public school is going to. It's never going to have a fancier science lab than a public school is going to have. What really drives people and gets people into Catholic schools, I believe, is highlighting the things that are different. And so if you basically secularize your curriculum, you jump on the latest fads that are running through the public schools, and you use exactly the same curriculum and standards that public schools do, I think you undercut the argument for why anybody should pay your tuition. So I'm an advocate, not everybody agrees with me. I'm an advocate for substantially increasing the Catholic identity. Has to start with, in my case, recruiting school leaders who believe in that vision. They in turn hiring people as teachers who believe in it. And as a short step, we instituted a requirement, which I'm amazed wasn't required from the beginning of time, that all teachers of religion have to be practicing Catholics. So we've stiffened up the requirements to become a principal of a Catholic school in terms of faith. We've done the same for religion teachers. And we're also strongly encouraging people to expand kind of the Catholic intellectual tradition throughout their entire curriculum.
Thanks so much. So I want to strongly recommend to folks the concluding chapter that Patrick has produced. It's not only very, very compelling, but it builds on his really strong academic career evaluating private school choice. And Patrick, tell us a little bit about how Catholic schools in DC or in New Orleans and Louisiana and elsewhere, how they tend to perform in terms of enrollment and results when you're evaluating private school choice programs.
Sure. So Catholic schools now compose slightly less than half of all private school enrollments in the United States. This has not been the case for 150 years. For 150 years, Catholic school enrollments dominated private schooling in the United States, but we've fallen below the 50% line. But when it comes to enrollment in private school choice programs, the ratio, it's about 60% to 2/3. So in a typical private school choice program, especially an urban focused one, about 2/3 of the participating students will choose Catholic schools. And so in a sense, when I evaluate a private school choice program, in many respects, I'm evaluating Catholic schooling, the effect of Catholic schooling. We've seen clear positive effects, especially on educational attainment, on how far kids go in school, how long they remain connected to the academic project. I mean, I was an extreme case, right? I mean, I went all the way to the PhD, but Catholic schools and private school choice programs that rely heavily on Catholic schools to deliver what we call the treatment, the programmatic treatment of school choice, those students enroll in, persist in, and graduate from college at significantly higher rates as a result of that opportunity. And we've also seen positive achievement effects in DC and New York through a privately funded program, Dayton, Ohio, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The one cautionary note was Louisiana. There's a statewide private school choice program in Louisiana. It's a very heavily regulated program. So there were lots of restrictions on private schools. There's even sort of a subtle suggestion that the state commissioner of public instruction could kick out a school for its curriculum. So as a result, only 1/3 of the private schools in Louisiana chose to participate because the regulations were so onerous and such a threat to their identity and autonomy. And in that case, in that one case of the Louisiana program, we see negative effects on student learning. So for me, that's just a cautionary tale. That's a statement that we should avoid overregulated private school choice program, but it in no way impugns private school choice initiatives themselves or Catholic schooling.
Great, thank you so much. So we are out of time, and in true Pioneer fashion, we want to make sure that we are punctual in ending the program. We really are grateful for everyone's participation. I'm very grateful for the editors and the authors and everyone who worked on the book, and encourage you to buy the book. It's available on Amazon. You can find more details on Pioneer Institute's website, pioneer.org. Thanks so much.